Communications, and this station.
Music education is a very important part of learning. Certainly it is at two Delta institutions, and we're going to be talking to those institutions today to find out more about what Mississippi Valley State and Mississippi Delta Community College are doing to educate students in music. Good morning and welcome to Delta Talk. I'm your host, David Dallas. Delta Talk, brought to you by the CAP Center in Indianola and the Boys and Girls Clubs of the Mississippi Delta. Our guests today are Lawrence Goldman. Lawrence is the keyboard instructor, professor at Mississippi Valley State University, and Harvey Jackson. Harvey is the choral director at Mississippi Delta Community College. Thank you both so much for being here with us today.
Great to be here.
Yes, great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Listen, I wanted to talk to and find out a little bit more about the music education programs at both of your institutions. But first, I'd like to, Lawrence, talk to you because you two have a special relationship with each other. You and Harvey, you were one of his professors when he was at Mississippi Valley State University. So I'd like to start with you, Lawrence, if you don't mind. How did you get here to the Delta? So let's start there, and then I want to talk about your music inspiration.
Well, there's a very simple answer to that original question. Mm-hmm. They offered me a job in my field. And that was 41 years ago. And
41 years ago.
1980, yeah.
Yeah. And where were you before you came here?
I had completed an interim position at Alabama State University, and I was in Louisiana a couple of years before that, and finished my doctorate immediately before that.
And doing keyboard work? Is that
yes. My doctorate's in piano performance, all my degrees.
Yeah. Where are you from originally?
I'm from Santa Rosa, California,
so
the Bay Area.
So you went from the Bay Area and then came south. What brought you south?
Again, you go where the work is, in higher education especially. In the arts and humanities, especially.
So, but you studied in California. You studied
for the most part.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, Lawrence, you're a pianist.
Yes.
Talk to folks a little bit about your inspiration, how you got to be a pianist, because I wonder sometimes how many pianists are out there now at this age, and were there a lot when you were growing up?
Well, there is no shortage of them, I can tell you that for sure.
Okay.
And of course, it's always been the predominant instrument that music students start on. Mm-hmm. Sometimes, even if they branch out into other fields, they often will have a piano foundation. Mm-hmm. And I'd almost have to go back to the womb to try and remember how I got started with it.
So you were that young?
I was very young when I started taking an interest in it. My parents were both musicians. Mm-hmm. Mother was a violinist, father's a clarinetist. Started formal training around the age of 7.
Yeah,
which is not unusual nowadays. You see them doing it even younger than that.
Right. No,
4 or 5, 6 years old.
Yeah, we have a 6-year-old, and we're trying to think is now the time to get him in piano lessons. So,
yeah.
And would you recommend that? Because I know for me, I took piano as a young child, and I fought it for all 6 years while my parents tried to get me to take it. And now I really wish I could sit down at the piano and play. Now I can read music, but I can't really.
If I had $1 for everybody who's told me something like that, I wish I'd stayed with it. I wish I'd.
So what do you tell people? What do you do to encourage people, or who encouraged you to stay with it?
Well,
I know your parents were both musicians.
Yes, that had a big part in it.
Right.
And I just took to it. It didn't really take much coercion or anything. Mm-hmm. It was just something I had the natural affinity to do. So I guess I was lucky in that respect, and I'm one of those people who always knew what he wanted to do in life.
That's great. And it is an artistry to play the piano. So you're more than just an instructor. You're an artist, a musical artist.
Yes, and in fact, I'm the only full-time piano person in my department.
At Valley.
Yeah, at Valley.
Yeah.
So I have to do it all, anything that involves the keyboard.
Well, let me ask you this before we talk to Harvey. Can you tell us when you met Harvey the first time at Mississippi Valley?
Well, it would have been when he came in as a student.
Yeah.
Okay, 2007. Oh, well, it's been almost 15 years now, then, hasn't it?
Harvey looks a lot younger, doesn't he?
One thing I've found over the years, when you've been there as long as I have, everything kind of starts to run together.
I
sometimes you're surprised when you realize how long it's been since you've worked with some of these.
Yeah.
And now some of my former students who I taught straight out of high school are retiring.
Wow.
Which really makes me feel like I'm up there.
So, Harvey, you got to Mississippi Valley State University as a freshman. Did you know you wanted to do music?
Yes, I knew I wanted to do music. I actually got my inspiration through church. My father put me as the leader of the church choir at an early age, and
like as a teenager.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. Yeah. So I was the director of my church choir. We were an a cappella choir, so that's where I developed my early stages of, my ear training and all from, an all a cappella choir. And during one of my rehearsals, he actually had Mr. Orlando Moss, he's Dr. Orlando Moss.
Right.
He had him to come over and do a clinic with our church choir. So, of course, me being the director, we kind of made that, made that connection, and I was about maybe 10th grade.
Yeah.
And he told me, he said, son, once you become a senior, I want you to come over and audition for me at Mississippi Valley State University. I have some money for you.
Well,
So
that always helps.
Yes, yes. So
now, where were you growing up? What church?
Cleveland, Mississippi.
In Cleveland, Mississippi.
Cleveland, Mississippi. My church is in Mound Bayou, Lambton Street Church of Christ.
Okay.
In Mound Bayou, my father is the pastor. So, like I said, I was, he kind of put that burden on me early.
Right.
Of just being in the kind of the forefront. He always opened up opportunities musically for me, whether it was my community choirs or church choir or or whatever. But the reason I came to Valley was, of course, my father was an instructor there, and also I met Mr. Moss, who gave me a shot at 10th grade. He basically told me that he already had a scholarship waiting on me once I became a senior.
I want to go in this direction briefly, if I can, and actually, you are both welcome to talk more about it, because you mentioned being in a church and singing. Can you talk about the spiritual element of music and vocals for you, and for you, Lawrence, the spiritual element in music that you are inspired by or play in? Harvey, if you'd start.
Yes. Well, for me, it's always church. So that's pretty much where I've gotten my basis from, in terms of just, my upbringing was through, being at church. And again, like I said, just being able to open that element of music and kind of bridge that with, Christianity. Of course, a lot of the songs and the hymns that we sing about even outside of the church is pretty much dealing with the church and, God. So I just think it's important to kind of, just be able to bridge music along with the text and kind of make that connection with the students, with the audience, and to just be able to captivate them to, kind of get the message of the song over to them.
Because I was just thinking, your father felt like he needed music in his church, and he was willing to, or he found you and said, okay, I know you've got the ability to do this.
Well, my godmother was the original choir directress. So, of course, I studied up under her. And then, of course, like I said, it just kind of took off. I was just kind of learning more. I was kind of studying more. She went to school at Jackson State University. She received a minor in music. So, of course, once I got my degree, of course, that kind of put me over the top of her, and that, allowed me to assume the full-time position of choir director and minister of music at my church.
Lawrence, you've posted, and I've seen some of the music that you've posted, so I know that you understand the sort of the spiritual element in classical music, and the way composers have always sort of moved or used that history or those spiritual feelings to offer the compositions and develop compositions.
Well, I definitely think that making music is a spiritual experience, not necessarily from a strictly religious standpoint, although some of the earliest uses of music we know historically came from church and religious ritual, and that's much of the outgrowth of music came from that. But, there are many quotations you can find from various philosophers and composers that music expresses what you cannot express in words.
Yeah.
And it has that intangible quality to it.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the things that's kept me committed to it as long as it has.
And I've noticed for me that, I just enjoy church, or whether no matter whether you're at a synagogue or whether you're at a Christian church, I just enjoy church so much more when there's music involved in it.
Sometimes it's the best part.
You don't want to tell the pastor that sometimes, but that is sometimes the best part of you. So what was your inspiration, Lawrence? Let's go to you. What was your inspiration musically? As you have sort of developed as an instructor, but also as a musician, as an artist, where did your inspiration come from?
Well, I think from the music itself, I would have to say, and I do not myself compose original works. That's just not my area of expertise or interest. So, but when you latch on to a piece of music that just means a lot to you, some of the pieces I have in my repertoire I've been playing for more than 50 years, literally. That's a motivation in and of itself.
And so you do interpret the music, though.
I would say
that's
yes.
That is the role of the piano or the musician to do that. And does that? How does that happen for you?
Well, really the highest goal of a musical performer especially when you're performing other people's works, is to almost make it seem as if you're creating that work right on the spot, that it has that kind of spontaneity and spark to it.
How do you do that?
And, well, it's an intangible thing. It's an intangible thing. But I think the audiences know it when they hear it.
Yeah.
And
Lawrence, when's the last time that you've played here? I know in Greenwood you've done some concerts in the evenings, and I was wondering if there's one coming up.
well, of course, the performance calendars have been kind of
awful,
stagnant. Yeah. So I don't have any specific dates planned.
Yeah. Let's talk about that too for a minute, if both of you would, because you're working at a school.
Yes.
And it's very complicated. You're singing, and I remember when getting because I sing in my choir. No, I'm not a good singer. I'll sit with my wife and I'll sing along, and I can sing with people.
Gotcha.
But I remember being really kind of nervous and worried when the Episcopal Church came out with singing is singers have to be masked up, and you shouldn't have more than 4 singers in a choir. They need to be spaced apart by 6 feet. How have you guys handled that?
Well, it was a total shock, for me at first, just wondering how we were going to bring these kids together, keep them safe, of course, keep them, following the CDC guidelines and all. And before we could even get to that stage, it was cut right from under us. They pretty much kind of just did away with all extracurricular activities. So there was no choir, there was no band, there was no football season. So
so last year, even I know it was athletics, but so it impacted you.
Yes.
You could not have.
Yes, it was completely virtual. So we tried a couple of days trying to sing over Zoom. Awful experience, and it was just really no way to overcome it. So you just really had to go back and just kind of focus on the basics. Okay, we can't do a lot of singing together because of different, Wi-Fi connection rates and all that. So it's just let's just go back to the basics, of music. Let's go back and fundamentals.
So
that's what I had to push a lot.
Were you able to keep all the kids engaged?
Yes.
Still?
Yes.
Yeah. So
yes.
So they stayed with you, and nobody lost scholarships or anything like that.
No.
DCC?
No. All the students were still able to get their scholarships who were trying to attain one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's not been fully appreciated is folks in the performing arts, including teaching, are among the most impacted by this pandemic.
Yes.
And I want to come back after the break and talk a little bit about that. So thank you both. We are visiting today with Lawrence Goldman, Mississippi Valley State University's keyboard instructor, and with Harvey Jackson, the Mississippi Delta Community College choral director. We'll be right back on Delta Talk.
Question for you.
Talk. I'm your host, David Dallas. Delta Talk, brought to you by the Cap Center in Indianola and the Boys and Girls Clubs of the Mississippi Delta. We're talking music education in the Delta today with Lawrence Goldman, Dr. Lawrence Goldman at Mississippi Valley State University, the keyboard instructor. And we're also talking with Harvey Jackson, who is the new choral director at Mississippi Delta Community College. And Harvey, just to clarify, you before you took the job, you've just recently been hired as the choral director.
Yes, in February of this year, I was recently at Gentry High School. So from 2015 up until February of this year, I was at Gentry High School.
Who reached out to you about the job at Mississippi Delta, or did you just know that it was coming available and you wanted to apply?
Yeah, I had heard through the, just the talks of the town that the position was coming available. Actually, the new department chair in Mississippi Valley, she reached out, Dr. Kimberly Broadwater.
Right, Dr.
She said, hey, this position is available. Yeah. And by the time she had reached out, I had really already applied, and, it was just had my fingers crossed.
Well, can you talk just a little bit about how the COVID crisis, the pandemic, has impacted Mississippi Delta Community College, and then I want to talk to you, Lawrence, about how it's impacted
yes.
Valley.
So once I got to Mississippi Delta in February, of course, classes were already going on. I was not teaching anything, but I was just coming in to kind of get my feet wet and get used to the environment. But there was a class in particular. It was an MDCC ambassador band that had just been formed, and it was basically like students from band who had an interest in popular music and students from the ambassador show choir who had an interest in popular music. So Mr. Ben Folks, who's over the recording industry program at Mississippi Delta, he was over the class, and basically they were putting together this showcase. Well, of course, this was to my ability because I just got finished doing these type of showcases at the B.B. King Museum in Indianola, Mississippi. I was the director of the musical arts program. So that's what we did with the showcases. So he brought me in, and I was able to kind of form some type of connection with the students through through those couple of classes that he had left within the semester, and they actually performed a successful showcase. I believe it was April 20th.
Okay.
So again, that was kind of like my first experience at the collegiate level working with students for that showcase.
Yeah, and they were able to do that in spite of the pandemic.
Yes, in spite of the pandemic, of course, socially distanced, masked up, just disinfecting everything. So classes were still happening at Mississippi Delta. They just were virtual at the high school level. So it went from me teaching classes on Zoom to the next week I'm, helping out someone in, their class preparing for a showcase.
You're right, in front of people and with people. Lawrence, what about?
Well, I'll tell you, after 40 plus years as a college music teacher, you think you're ready for anything.
Yeah.
But I have now discovered that it was not the case.
Right.
And of course, when we went virtual, which happened very abruptly, as it did with everyone, well, for instance, several of my students did not have an instrument to play on at home.
Right, because pianos are not cheap.
Exactly.
Or even a keyboard.
I teach all the music majors. I don't just teach piano majors.
Oh, okay.
For instance, students in class piano, that's not their main forte, so they wouldn't necessarily have an instrument. So that was the first issue I had to contend with.
Right.
And like Harvey was saying, you kind of have to go back to basics and just do fundamental musicianship to at least keep them in the game somewhat.
Right. Did you feel like you were able to do that?
To some extent. It wasn't how I had planned spending the rest of that semester.
Well, what about, so you closed, I guess, in the spring of 2020, is that right?
Yeah, right after spring break.
Yeah, and then how have you managed up until this point?
It's been mostly in-person classes. Of course, there are always a certain number of classes that are online anyway. And I've also learned what the word hybrid means now.
Yeah.
A lot of classes they will combine, and I had never even heard of Zoom before all this happened.
Right.
But sometimes they will combine in-person meetings. Sometimes they will rotate students in and out in different groupings.
Yeah.
Some online and some in person. So they just have to kind of be creative.
Lawrence, you worked with Harvey when he was there. Can you talk about some of the students that have come through your program and where they are now, and how many of them are in the Delta that you can kind of speak to, and some of the things they've been dealing with as part of this pandemic?
Well, a lot of them I'm sure could share the same kind of stories that we're talking about. And of course, over the length of time I've been there, you're talking about hundreds of students who have come through my classroom and my teaching studio. A large percentage of them are teachers themselves.
Yeah.
And they've been very successful all the way elementary level through college. We have a number of them who have gotten their PhDs or teaching college level music.
Yeah.
Or college level music administrators.
I'm assuming you keep up with a pretty good number of them.
A lot of them.
Yeah.
Some of them going back 40 years that I still stay in touch with.
Yeah. What can you tell me somebody that you're particularly, other than Harvey, of course, who's right here with you?
Well, naturally, of course. Yeah.
But can you tell me somebody else that maybe you're just like, I'm really glad that I had a good experience with that student and that they've been able to accomplish things?
Well, I'll give a little plug to my former student, Dr. Kelvin Towers, who is the chair of the music department at Coahoma Community College.
Yes.
So we're well represented at the community colleges right now.
That's great.
In fact, one of our other former students is the assistant band director at that school. And so he has done extremely well. He's finished his PhD and runs a tight ship there and does an excellent job with their music department and with the choir, which he's the director of the Coahoma Community College Choir. So I'm very proud of that. And he was a piano major student of mine for 4 years.
Yeah. Can you speak, both of you actually, kind of what are you seeing from, and I know you're fairly new to the game.
Yes.
Certainly compare it to Dr. Goldman, Harvey. But what have you seen in terms of the level of musicianships and preparedness among students that are coming out of high school when they come to your community college or when they come to Mississippi Valley? Has that changed in any way?
Well, I would say it's highly variable, and we do not have an extremely rigorous audition process. We do audition our students, but we kind of specialize in taking students from sometimes a rather rudimentary level, and it's amazing what they can accomplish if they put their mind to it.
Well, that's what I was going to ask, because I would just assume that music education is probably not where it needs to be, and probably it's not where it was 20 or 30 years ago.
It's come a long way, but still has a way to go.
And that goes back to what's happening during the pandemic, too. So a lot of these students we would normally recruit straight out of high school, they haven't been with their band program in person or their choir program. Some of them haven't even had an instrument to play on.
Yeah.
And, That's a big stumbling block,
Yes.
but we've gotten them coming through the doors anyway.
Yeah.
We're going to have to make up for some lost time.
Well, so how difficult is that, and how much does it depend on the students? Like you said, where they're just going to put their nose to the grindstone and make it work, and they're going.
Well, in the end, everything comes down to that. Really.
Yeah.
What the student is motivated and prepared to do, but that's true of any student at any time.
Yeah, and probably in any field. But
Exactly. Yeah.
But also, we just hope that, like Dr. Goldman said, that the choir director or the band director, he still kept in touch with those students. They still kept in touch, and basically fundamentals was the push. During this pandemic, because that's really, I'm not going to say it was the best that we could do, but just on the spot, the way that it happened so abruptly, that was, if we were successful in basically just keeping them interested through going back to the fundamentals and pushing their musicianship from that standpoint, then I think, that we were quite successful.
Yeah, you accomplished something.
Yes.
And
just keeping them involved. That's a big part of it. And frankly, I don't know how I would have fared if I was a student when all of this happened. I've thought about that before.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's what we had to think about. Like, we know that it took a toll on us as educators.
Right.
But what did it do mentally for the students? And I just had to always keep that in mind. I mean, this is basically a new way of learning. Some kids, particularly where I was, they were on their Zoom classes, but they had little brother, little sister right beside them in their Zoom classes, trying to keep them, on point with their lesson, while of course mom and dad is off to work or whatever. So it took a lot out of them.
Yeah.
So we just had to be conscious of that and just kind of maybe cater to their needs, rather than more so just worry about ourselves as educators.
Right. So I'm sure you felt like you had to adapt, and as you mentioned, you're watching someone else have to deal with something that they've never had to.
Yes.
We had the same problem with our Boys and Girls Club kids. When we had our clubs closed, it was really difficult to keep them engaged that way because it was difficult for them.
Yes.
It wasn't, more, and it is something that professors and teachers and instructors and mentors have to think about. Where are your students coming from?
Right.
Let me ask you both this. Where do you feel like, and I know we're in the middle of the pandemic, and I know you're all going to struggle, where do you feel like you're going to be able to, or your programs are going? And Lawrence, I know, you're probably not in the position, you're doing the piano work and working with Dr. Kimberly Broadwater, but where do you see the institutions going in terms of music education going forward?
Well, really, at this point, we're trying to get back to an even keel.
Yes.
Yeah.
I guess is the best way of putting it, from where we were before, and that's a big job in itself. And we did have declines in enrollment. There's no doubt about that. That was a nationwide phenomenon. So just got to take it a step at a time. Having grand plans and ambitions right now is
And that's what I was
a little bit premature.
Yeah, because really you're not even able to schedule your performing events or things like that.
Exactly.
Has there been any indication, as you talk to the university or to the community college administration, what are the plans for those types of activities in the fall?
Well, I mean, we have some events planned. Of course, they're
Tenuous?
Yes, tenuous.
Yeah.
I mean, just depending on how this, pandemic is going. But students are returning back. Of course, masks are still being, enforced, getting them vaccinated. There's plenty of opportunities, for them to do that on campus if they haven't been vaccinated already. And just basically following the CDC guidelines as we did before. But like I said, the push is getting them back. They're coming back. So I guess we'll try to do the best we can. Like I said, just kind of bridging the gap of lost time and just trying to move forward the best we can day by day. I mean, we find out something new about this virus daily.
Yeah,
so,
and I think we're kind of in the same boat. We don't know whether or not we're going to be able to. We had our clubs open for the summer. We're not sure we're going to be able to keep them open during the fall.
Yes.
And so what about the
you have a lot of kids under 12, don't you?
Yeah, we have young kids too.
Don't qualify to be vaccinated.
Yeah, and so that's something. And you did mention vaccination. So your institutions are encouraging. You're not making a requirement though for people to be vaccinated.
No, many hundreds of schools around the country are, but we are not as of yet.
Yeah. So that's something that could be coming.
They did reinstate the mask the mask requirement though.
Okay,
because they had dropped that at one point for vaccinated folks.
Okay. Let me as we've got just about 2 minutes left. Thank you. This is a great conversation. I so appreciate this. I do want to ask though about again, when I talked about musical inspirations, Lawrence, I've heard you play, and Harvey, I have not heard your choral group, but who are the composers? Who do you love? Who do you love to perform when you're at the piano, and who do you, What composers do you look to as you want your children or your students to sing, your choral groups to sing?
Well, starting off for me, I was deeply embedded with Negro spirituals.
Yeah.
So it was the Moses Hogan, I did a lot of him. But recently, of course, we've discovered there are so many new composers coming out with new music, and that's kind of the thing that's going now, especially on the choral side, are the composers that we have here right now that are composing new works, and and that's kind of where we're kind of, I don't want to say tearing away from the Moses Hogans and of course the classical pieces and stuff, but is what these new composers have going. They're able to infuse a lot of different new techniques and things like that. So it makes it interesting and more fun to be able to tackle these new compositions that are coming out.
Okay, Lawrence, 30 seconds left. Tell me.
I have kind of a cop-out answer to that question.
Do it.
Whoever I'm playing at that moment, you kind of have to put yourself in the mindset, that is my very favorite piece, and otherwise you won't do a convincing performance for the audience.
Oh, that's interesting.
So that's how I go. That's how I think about that.
Lawrence, Harvey, thank you both so much for being with us today. It's great to talk
so much.
Music in the Delta. Thank you all for being with us today on Delta Talk.
You've been listening to Delta Talk, a public affairs presentation of TeleSouth Communications and this station.